Hey, get in, fellas. We're taking accountability. That's right. We're going to stick to a theme, something men generally have to work on as they mature into their life. And that is taking accountability. The opposite of avoidance. This is the cleanest, healthiest word, when used correctly, that we get introduced on this podcast. So accountability is going to help us wrap up the addiction block this week because, as we've learned from all of our great guests, that you cannot truly stay in maintenance and stay in a healthy phase of your recovery without taking accountability for your actions and the way things go. Accountability top to bottom today. We're going to start with an unlikely source. Our old friend, we talked about him in a not so nice way at the very first episode. Draymond Green learns a lesson in accountability, and Richie and I will talk about that. We then have on the fellas from Ananeo Transitional Housing. Transitional housing means that you live there potentially after you re-enter society from incarceration. So that's a big accountability. You're getting out of prison. You're trying to build your life back together. So we're going to be talking about accountability and homelessness, poverty, incarceration as it relates to addiction to mental health. Great group of guys who came on. Super fun interview. And we're going to wrap up by introducing and inducting Earlonne Woods into the Bromotions Hall of Fame. He is the co-host of a very popular podcast called Ear Hustle, which talks about life inside prison and the hard work he's done to reshape his life through incarceration. Accountability, it's a great theme. I hope y'all are ready to learn. Let's go. Richard, it is Championship Sunday. How exciting. We have 3 games of football left. And we're about to get this shit done so you and I can sit down and watch some football.
And do some editing. Yes.
And do some editing. Yes, Richie is editing on Sundays. We appreciate his hustle and getting all that stuff done. So we're going to talk accountability today, as you guys heard up top. Surprisingly, we're going to be talking about accountability as it relates to one of the people in the sports world who has been the worst at taking accountability on the court in his career, and that is Draymond Green, Michigan State grad, has played for the Warriors his whole career. And Richie and I are specifically going to talk about an article that came out this month from Om Youngmisuk on ESPN.com, quote, how an indefinite suspension revitalized Draymond's career. A little bit of backstory. After a couple physical altercations on the court, Draymond was suspended for 5 games and then 12 games last year, and that's the indefinite suspension that we're referring to. Richie, what'd you think about the article? Pretty good.
It was really enlightening seeing, some of the work and stuff that he's done on the back end that doesn't really get the shine in the media that it probably should. So it's great on Ohm for writing this article and highlighting some of the things Draymond's been doing to work on himself in light of everything.
Yeah, and especially because it's such a good example of Draymond struggled so much with taking accountability on the court that it gave a perception of him being like not a good guy. You go ahead and try and swing on your teammate, deserve it or not deserve it, right? But it takes away from the fact that he is a good young father, a good husband, and a leader in the community, does a lot of charity and philanthropy work. But I will say it, I think it behooves somebody to be the same person everywhere they are, and his inability to control his temper and take accountability on the court has made him very unlikable.
Right, yeah, and that's one of the things that the article highlights is he just had a young daughter named Hunter. After all these infractions, I don't want my children to see me as this person. I'm more than this person, and I have to do something to change that because this is the way I'm being perceived outside of my home and presumably maybe inside by his kids from what they've all seen, the media talking about, and all the things that he's done on and off the court.
And, the article does a really good job. So one of the keys to success for Draymond is we can laugh at this. He has 2 therapists and a sports psychologist that he works with. But what I found to be probably the linchpin to this was how seriously he had to take it, because as Adam Silver called this, he was having check-in calls, or DGs, so Draymond Green's check-in calls, starting as frequently as twice a week with 7 league officials. So the GM of the Warriors, Adam Silver himself, his agent Rich Paul, right? A group of people all important to Draymond who were having him jump on these calls twice a week. And initially, as we might expect, and that's why I love this story of growth for Draymond, it has a lot of respect. He was answering the call on the phone in the car without the camera on. And they were like, nope, motherfucker, you're going to be not driving with the camera on, looking at all of us right in the face. Mm-hmm. And Draymond said, at the beginning, I did not want to do these, and I was not interested. I didn't think it was necessary. And by the end, when they were ready to taper him off the calls in general, so he went from twice a week all the way down to once a month last season, he wanted to continue to have them. He felt like it was important to hold him accountable, and he learned that lesson that, in his therapy, he said he began about 2 years ago, and Green was quoted as saying, starting therapy was fucking hard because I'm from Saginaw, Michigan. I'm from an all-black neighborhood. You don't go to therapy or you're fucking weak. So you're retraining a brain that's been thinking a certain way for 30 years. Again, 2 therapists, a sports psychologist, these accountability buddy groups, and I'm really impressed by the NBA. I mean, John Morant, I know, had to do something pretty similar to this when he was on his indefinite suspension. Clearly, these are big name guys. I mean, I hope anybody with a contract would get this kind of attention. Draymond and Ja are going to. But it sounds like Draymond needed what a lot of young men who don't grow up with healthy modeling needed, which is a group of other dudes to say, hey, man, we love you. Could you quit fucking up? We'll be here for you. Can you take some accountability? And it's not like Draymond is an evil person, just a bad temper. And like most men who are externalizers, which men with ADHD, men with conduct issues, men who grow up in lower SES statuses, it's everybody else's fault. Mm-hmm. That is what we are taught as little kids, is like, if you're tough, it's not you, it's them, it must be them, right? And so I think Draymond really struggled with that behavior when he would get escalated on the court, and he really had to learn, I had a role in this, they had a role in it. And we've already seen this season that he's been doing a much better job in terms of his temper. I know Coach Steve Kerr has had a lot of positive things to say about his ability to control his temper this year, both on and off the court and practice and games.
Yeah, and the article discusses like how he had to go from being, like you were saying, like reactive to the situations, and now he's able to like put himself in the other person's shoes and like realizing, like, oh, this wasn't intentional, or this wasn't worthy of like an outburst. Like,
right,
the situation as a whole didn't require that, and that just taking that moment, taking that breath, just like being able to put yourself in that on the other side of things before blowing your stack.
And thinking about accountability just from a zoomed out mental health angle, like we think about kids, Richie, when you think about kids and accountability, what do you think it stops young men from taking accountability for their actions in the first place? What do you think stops people?
I think they're scared. I really think it's fear, like a fear of how they're going to be looking weak, looking like they can't handle themselves.
Fear of repercussions is usually a big thing when we're super young.
Yeah, exactly. That fear of like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble for doing this or something like that. Yeah.
Shame and guilt, right? So it's generally fear. Rich, you hit the nail on the head there, that fear is really what drives us to be any kind of, defense mechanisms. And so we'd be talking about denial here when you're not taking accountability, and denial, as we know, is a really immature defense mechanism. So, that wasn't me, that was Johnny, you lie to blame it on your sibling. And so those are things that we tend to grow out of, except that we see adults all the time who struggle to take accountability, and in more stressful situations, like on the court when you're as jacked up, as Draymond and others are, you can see how you might point a finger right away. And it only is the most mature players, the older guys, the vets who, when something happens, they go, my bad, right? They point up, they say, foul on me, all that kind of stuff. I know we've all seen that cheesy commercial where that kid says to his coach, like, nah, coach, it was off on me. And the kid taking accountability for, the call.
Yeah, I mean, look at Draymond's teammate, Steph Curry. I mean, he's like the epitome of like being a good person, a good role model for people on the court and off the court. I mean, he's never been that kind of reactive hothead. You never hear any of these kind of controversies happening with him.
He's thrown his mouthpiece a couple times.
He's never punched anyone in the nuts or the face, though.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
True. Unlike their former teammate Chris Paul, notorious nut puncher.
Notorious.
One of my favorite things that Draymond talked about in this article, as we get close to wrapping, is that he had to merge his on and off court personalities. And it's interesting to think 35 years, right? Draymond's our age. He's had so much time, but even he saw, as most athletes are trained to, he's a good husband, a good father, a good person in the community. And yet his on-court personality didn't resonate with that at all. Right. And it shows just how we get into these workplaces, we get under these conditions, and it's like he's not even trusting his own moral compass. He's not living by his own moral compass that he has otherwise developed in his life. And so that one of his biggest successes has been he seems happier. He's enjoying the game more. He's more engaged. He's having more fun. And all those things are really important that when we ask our feelings to get siloed off, we're not ourselves, we're not authentic, and we're not able to enjoy and just be present as we would be. And Draymond does a really nice job talking on that.
Like you said, some scuffles this year, but not nearly anything like he's had in the past. A couple scuffles with Zach Edey and, a couple here and there. But overall, you can really see that he has been putting in that work and not being short-sighted in his reactions to things that are happening to him or around him on the basketball court.
My apologies if I say this multiple times in this episode, but I want to wrap with one of my favorite quotes about accountability from Principles of DBT, which is, we don't always create our problems and it's on us to solve them. So that idea of really what we can be accountable for is how we react to things and how we respond to situations versus we cannot control the world around us. We cannot control what happens to us. People oftentimes struggle to take accountability when things aren't fair, when they're frustrated about how things are going and their responses are over the top. So just remember, we can only control how we respond to the things that happen to us. We can't control what happens to us. And so that's a good example with Draymond. Yeah, he gets hit, and so he can't control that, and he gets angry and punches somebody. Hey, buddy, that is where we have to take accountability, is our responses within our own control. Other people do not make us feel anything. We have accountability there. So not easy, simple sounding and not easy, Richie. I know we both had to work on this stuff a lot.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
For sure. All right, well, hopefully we've got a positive result to report on later in this week. Otherwise, let's go Buffalo. See y'all here for the interview here in a sec.
Peace.
All right, do we have any singers in the crowd? Anybody who wants to lead us in a vocal exercise?
Listen, I'm no singer, but I'm not afraid. I'll get down.
How would you like to warm
karaoke?
up, Luke? How would we get ready for today?
You're gonna want to warm up the vocals by a nice let's take that into in fella. We're going to therapy. That's as good as I got, Steven.
Fellas, we are lucky to be joined today by the crew from Ananeo Transitional Housing here in Colorado. So I'm going to introduce everybody one by one, but we got a bunch of bros today who really work at that facility in all sorts of different capacities. Luke Gregory, he's the CEO and owner of Ananeo. He is a Denver native, but strangely, the strangest combination of sports allegiances I've ever heard.
Yep.
Detroit Red Wings, Iowa Hawkeyes wrestling, as he is a big jiu-jitsu MMA guy, and then Oklahoma, boo, Sooner football. Boo! I got a lot of friends that are poked here in town.
Haters gonna hate. Let's talk titles, boys.
Yeah. And then Joel Miller, who is a licensed professional counselor. He's the clinical supervisor as they provide mental health services at Ananeo. We're going to get all into that. A Colorado native of the Greeley, Fort Collins area. If Greeley sounds familiar, Joel, we had on Keith Bradley a few weeks ago, who's a professional interventionist. Super cool guy and really like a role model as a guy who's learned a lot about the addiction world. We joked he's a fair weather fan, said he just liked the Bulls growing up as a kid. And you know what? Unsurprisingly, he's not a Cowboys fan, as fair weather kids would have been in the 90s. Yeah. Sean Whitworth is the health management coordinator and peer coaching lead. So Sean is one of those super unlikable Waco, Texas guys. And as a result, a Dallas sports fan. Right. Sean, who's going to be the coach of your team? We're recording this on Friday. Do you think
it's not Dion?
Wednesday?
It's not Dion.
It's sure not Dion. I'm thinking we're just going to pick somebody's up from like Wendy's or something. Just pull up to the drive-thru and see if they want a job, and maybe that'll work.
Yeah, because everybody from Texas seems to think they know football, so you'd probably be good there, huh?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. That's
you're smack in between. I don't know if you had any UT allegiance, but I'm happy to say, I'm an Ohio State guy. We took out UT a couple weeks ago.
I'm down too.
Ohio State, kind of like the Detroit Lions this week. All the hype is are our coordinators going anywhere? The transfer portal snaking our best players. So it's good times to be a Buckeye as everybody hates our guts.
Jeremiah's a dog. We could talk all podcasts about that kid. Unbelievable.
It's amazing. My girlfriend is not a big sports person at all. And even by the end of the season, she was like, oh, right. I know him. Like he's
yeah,
just doing
exactly.
crazy stuff. So it's cool.
Comes with the
I
territory.
was joking. He shouldn't wait until next year after year 2 to petition. He should just try and bounce the NFL this year. Like really, labor laws and whatnot. Maybe the new administration will just be like workers' rights and let him.
Dude, Ryan Day would cry along with every single Ohio State fan. And I know that's not something strange for Ohio State fans, a bunch of crybabies over there, but you know, it'd be tough.
Since I moved out here, Luke, to Denver, I've tried to convince all the like CU fans, like, hey, you need like a team,
like a real team,
top 8 to 10 teams, like the money spending teams to root for.
Yep.
And they were like, why would we like root for Ohio State? You're the Yankees. Like my friends out here, again, I got a lot of Oklahoma State fans, like Texas A&M, who nobody cries for them, but they're like, you guys are the whiniest bunch of 12-game winners every single. Like, we spend the most money. We expect to win.
Man.
It makes sense. It's not like unfounded. It's you spend the money, you expect to do it. So unlike
big year.
You know, the Floridas and the whatnots of like, what are they up to? So we could talk sports all day, guys, but I wanted to just emphasize the reason these dudes are also good on camera is that the Ananeo facility has their own podcast called Creature Theory.
Yep.
And I listened to a few episodes to prep for this, but today we're going to be touching on who transitional housing serves, what it is. So we're going to talk about incarceration. We're going to talk about substance use as guys, we're wrapping up our addiction block of episodes today. And then homelessness. And so they have their residents of the facility come on and tell their stories of all of those topics and more. And if you're just interested in some human interest pieces, you know, Luke and Sean host the show, and it's really good. It's a great flow and just really good, candid conversations. Luke, we can talk podcast more a little bit, but tell us, what does Ananeo do? How did it become a thing? And help our audience understand something that I'm going to assume nobody listening to this show has interacted with before.
Yeah. So Ananeo, it means to renew. And, you know, obviously that's what we're doing. We're giving everybody a fresh start, especially when it comes to incarceration, reintegration into community. Our demographic is a little bit different than a lot of other housing organizations. You know, we really do pride ourselves in serving people who have no other chance. We are the only chance that they have. And that is really why our culture at Ananeo is so strong. Like guys like Sean, guys like Joel, like we love what we do. Our whole women's staff loves what they do. And it's just that, like we are a genuine lifeline for people off the streets, out of prison, who are on parole. Maybe it's out of family dysfunction. We deal with a lot of people who are just stuck around, you know, my parents are addicts and this and that, and I just need someplace else to go. So that's really who we are, what we do. We happen to have all of our clinical services, and I'll let Joel go deeper into that, attached to our apartments. So we have just around 230 beds that we can have people sheltered and in program. So it's really cool. You know, something I think just to generalize here, our program, we say if you can't go to work, you're working on yourself. So we really are a program that wants to get somewhere with people. So our whole goal is self-sustainability. We want to have individuals who go through our program who are free and living their life. So that's the goal there. I'd also say we're not sober warriors, right? I don't think that like sobriety is the biggest issue. I don't come from a sober, addicted background. I'm not sober now, that type of thing. So I'm not in recovery, I should say, more technically. I am sober now. All right, guys.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're really trying to help people just get on that path to being well.
I do know, I was talking about the program in general, though, that there's rules around, you know, coming in intoxicated, especially around safety. So it's interesting, Joel, maybe you can speak on this. Like, I know that there's insurance stuff that goes with the program. There's Medicaid funding. How do you call they're residents? They're not patients. You know, they're no longer incarcerated. So this isn't halfway housing, which I learned from one of Luke's coworkers. The difference between transitional housing means you are out of the system. Halfway housing, as it sounds, means you're half incarcerated, half not. Even a doctor, I did not know that till last week. And so how do you kind of think, Joel, of the population?
So we just kind of generally call clients. I work places that, kind of get hung up on the name of consumer or, like you said, tenant, resident, all these things. And we very specifically have people in our program to be in the program. And so we just kind of simply say, they're our clients. And to your question about people coming in, if they get referred to us and they get to our doorstep and they're intoxicated, we will potentially do a breathalyzer, UA, those kinds of things. And then based on what's going on, if they're also kind of unable to be, I mean, I say this in like, if they're extremely intoxicated, then we send people to detox, but then we also bring them back to say like, hey, let's make sure you're being monitored. And then you can come back and we can give this another shot. But if it's something manageable, then generally our coaches and managers will keep eyes on them, check on them and say, hey, you're blowing numbers, but you don't seem to be like staggering or a safety risk, to yourself or anybody, or falling downstairs, things like that, or any withdrawal potential, maybe overnight, things like that. We do kind of keep eyes on them, but it's just kind of a case by case. And so we really have this unique opportunity to be a program that can kind of cherry pick. So we're not abstinence. We're not 3 strikes. We're kind of show us you're interested, show us you're willing to do the work, and we'll meet you there. We want this to be something that's a good fit for the clients as well as the program, so that we're not inadvertently triggering other residents or other clients, in the program by saying, well, hey, this guy keeps coming in high or drunk. What's going on? Dropping 4 UAs a week. What's happening? So we are handling everybody's accountability and really making sure that they're engaging in the program, to the ability that they can, but also being respectful to the program's mission overall by making sure people are staying on track and getting the resources that they need.
It's interesting. I was thinking, Joel, like, what's the difference between this and a rehab facility is that it's not specifically substance use, right? The goal, it sounds like, is much more about stabilization, a healthy reentry into the world, those kinds of life skills. Sean, what's been your experience there? Like, what where are you seeing people come from who are residents there, and what do they stand to benefit from?
So yeah, we got guys from all genres, from all aspects of life, from all states, from everywhere. Mm-hmm. Mainly, I see most of our guys coming in are like reentry based, or either someone has been in the judicial system or been incarcerated, and those are most of our guys. But we don't really discriminate on who we take, right? We take anybody that's in need, right? We bring in people from all areas. I mean, we have people from several different states that are there that have moved out to the Denver/Aurora area, and are just seeking help. A lot of these guys are guys that wake up every day not knowing where they're going to sleep tonight. That's a big part of our population. Is a lot of these guys don't know what's next for them. They don't know what their plans are. They don't know where they want to be. They just know that they want something different in life. Mm-hmm. And I think around the Denver area, we've kind of created a name like, hey, man, if you're really struggling and there's someone that won't take you, hey, man, reach out to Ananeo. They might have an option. So, yeah, our guys and men and women are coming from everywhere. Yeah.
How'd you first get involved?
So, yeah, I have a pretty crazy story. I was originally incarcerated in Texas, did a bunch of time in Texas prison, roughly close to 20 years. And then I had a pending case out of Colorado, so I had to come up here and take care of it. And I was released from prison from DRDC here in Denver, kind of in pretty much.
Tell them that story, Sean. Tell them that story.
Yeah, I was cherry picking that, guys. I knew this story. Really, just
but this is the reality. This is the reality.
Oh yeah. I was extradited to state of Colorado. Went to Arapahoe County Jail. Was sent from there to DRDC. Kind of with no plans. I thought my plans were to go back to Texas, back with my family, back kind of like in the East Texas area. And they told me, no, you're getting out today. This is what it is. And they let me out of DRDC pretty much with nothing. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know where to go. I wound up walking from Denver all the way to Longmont, out past Boulder, kind of doing a little hitchhiking along the way. I didn't have any money or nothing. Yeah. Went to the parole office. It started snowing on my way, so I was kind of freaking out, like, man, what am I going to do? Like, I got to get back to Texas. I didn't have a phone or anything. So I went to Longmont parole office. They were like, oh, you don't report here. You got to report in Inglewood. I'm like, where's Inglewood at? I don't even know where that's at.
They're like 20 miles south.
Yeah. So they wound up getting me a bus pass, and I wound up going back down. But they were like, well, you're not going to make it on time. So you're going to have to go find somewhere to stay. And it was like snowing outside real hard. And I was like stressed out, like, man, I don't know what to do. So I wound up staying at the Denver Rescue Mission for one night. And I made a quick decision that day. That would be the last time I stayed at the Denver Rescue Mission.
That's Jesus Saves.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest homeless shelters in town.
They do a great work. They do a great work.
Done their warehouse, like donation center and the soup kitchens. But I bet, Sean, we can touch on that a little. I mean, I guess you were quote unquote homeless for one night.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like a fun time.
No, man, it's the absolute worst experience. Like, not knowing, I think, is the worst thing. Like not knowing what tomorrow brings or what tonight might actually bring was my thing. I didn't even know where I was at, and then the next day I wound up going to the parole office in Inglewood, making my way that way. And I was like, listen, I got to figure something out. And, one of the women that work at the parole office was like, let me try to reach out to somebody. So they reached out to Luke and were like, yeah, send him over there. And once I got to Ananeo, I was like, oh man, my plans were to go back to Texas. Right. But, once I got there and became part of the team and started working there, I was like, this is what it is for me. This is my calling right here. This is where I need to be.
So you were a resident. I mean, you were a resident first, a client first, and then worked your way. And I just was thinking this, Sean. I didn't put all those pieces together when I first heard your story. I worked for a year at the jail associated with DRDC, right there on Smith.
Yeah.
So I was seeing people all the time, and Sean, it's interesting. My experience having been a psychiatrist in a jail system was I don't let like 80% of these people drive my Uber. And I did not expect that to be my takeaway. I mean, it truly was an eye-opening thing. I'd worked with military veterans. I taught inner city school. And it sounds like as we think addiction here, Joel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Most people who end up incarcerated just did the wrong drug and did something stupid, wrong place, wrong time. The most of them are not violent people, not bad people, just
92%. 92% of people who are incarcerated struggle with a substance use disorder. So
I thought you were throwing out like non-violent offense rates or something.
No. I mean, it's just even not to, I'll let Joel talk about it, but even like in the genesis of Ananeo, like we thought we were going to be very extensive reentry service based, and it became quickly apparent we're not fighting like a prison problem, we're fighting a substance problem. Substances and addiction and mental health are what we really need to focus on. So it was a quick pivot there. But just to draw the point, Joel, that, the majority of the population is struggling with substances.
I'd also argue, Luke, if we zoom out even further, that, life, culture in America, the world, right, it's inherently traumatic. So as we're fighting a substance problem, I mean, really, we're up against a system that is much more reactive than it is proactive. And I think the prison system is the strongest aspect, truth of that. I mean, I'm sitting here behind a copy of the new Jim Crow and having taught elementary school. I worked in a district where it was very much like, if you can't read in third grade, you're going to prison. There is no doubt about it. Right. So just that idea of, if we could be thinking more proactively, schools and those kinds of interventions when it comes to how we treat each other and how we deal with our feelings, we're probably saving a lot of money in the long run.
Totally, man. And I think, Joel, chime in whenever you've got the cerebral stuff, man. I really love what Joel has to say. But, to me, it's like it kind of comes down to predisposition. With the majority of people we work with, they grew up with some sort of dysfunction or disorder in their family life, in their own personal life, based on their decisions. And I think the difference of predisposition and predetermination, you are predisposed to maybe low income family, maybe you have addiction in your family, maybe you don't have your father because he was locked up. You have all of these things that are really signs that are going to show that, hey man, these might be problems in your future, but you're not predetermined that way. And that's constantly what I think we're polling people through with peer services, coaching. Sean and the team is so good at that. We do that with therapy of these things happen to you and they are a huge part of your makeup. But ultimately, what environment are you creating around you that's going to make you determine where you're going to go in the future? It's kind of that kind of broken analogy, but basically your predisposition loads the gun, right? There is a bullet in that gun, but it's ultimately your environment that pulls the trigger. So I think that's kind of the balance that I've noticed when you bring up low income housing, you bring up poor schooling growing up, all those types of factors, they play a huge part, and you see it in our clientele all the time.
Joel, can you talk about the programming?
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, it depends on the person because, we don't really have a one size fits all. If anybody comes in, we do want to meet with them, kind of get some kind of grounding, just, who are you, what's going on? Obviously, earlier we talked about any acute intoxication, but we kind of have this conveyor belt where people come in, they get to meet with a coach or a manager just to get their bags and their stuff, literally on site. And then they meet with the case manager to, make sure they've got benefits like Medicaid established and those kinds of things started. And then any other resources, potentially food banks, other things like that. Maybe any pending appointments that they're like, hey, do you guys have bus passes and things like that? Because I've got a court date or something else, coming up. Really trying to connect those things to make sure they've got a pretty good resource base and support base to kind of start the process of success. And then they meet with our therapist who does a biopsychosocial assessment, which really dives a lot deeper into kind of current issues as well as any historical issues to be aware of. And I know, like we just talked about, one of the things we look at is an ACEs kind of assessment and aversive childhood experiences. And so, yes, everybody is off the charts. I mean, it's always almost feels silly to ask because given all the other considerations that we're factoring in, it's not surprising that these clients all come in with pretty high scores. And so, like we were saying earlier, I think that's another big challenge is how far up the stream are we addressing a lot of this stuff? Because in one hand, that, like you said, third grade to prison pipeline is still visible to this day. I mean, that's still a predictor, unfortunately. And so short of operating like an elementary program where we go in and say, does everybody have a strong male figure in their life? Does everybody have somebody reading to them? Does everybody have access to food and shelter and all these things? It's just really hard to know. And unfortunately, by the time we get some of these folks, they've kind of been in survival mode for so long that coming into our program, we have to unhinge some of that. I think we've talked about this before, kind of that armor that I've had to develop over time to just make it, and whether it's homelessness or incarceration, like they've been through a lot. And so meeting with that therapist is kind of where we start to unpack some of that stuff. And it's not a one and done thing. Obviously, they come in and giving your whole spiel in 5 minutes is not always easy for everybody, but we try and at least open that door and say, hey, there's these services available. And then we also have a psychiatric nurse practitioner who sees the clients to be able to address any medication needs. Another big thing we have, especially people leaving jails, prisons, is if they were stabilized on certain medications, we want to make sure we stay on that. We don't want anybody decompensating and losing the footing that they've maintained. And so that's really kind of the dream in terms of how it works. But
especially
we
coming
just
out of prisons, it can be the longest stint of sobriety that somebody's had, in their life. And obviously going through withdrawal in prison is a challenging thing. So we touched on, ACEs on this show a few times, but if you're new or you're catching us later, ACEs, Adverse Childhood Event Study out of Kaiser in California, was huge to help us understand the medical, the physical impact of trauma on the human body, brain, and changes to your immune system. So that's just a quick overview of that. You can go online and take your ACEs score. Just because you grew up in a suburb and went to college does not mean that you did not have things happen. A parent with mental illness, a parent with substance use, poverty, there are things that you can reflect on and understand that, a big part of what we do here, guys, is emphasize that, like, it's not us or them. We've all had experiences that impact who we are and how we see the world. And as a result, we should treat each other with kindness because you just don't know. You just
For
don't
sure.
know.
Well, and there's... Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, you never know. Like, you never know who's sitting next to you. So, someone could be fighting the invisible war that's sitting next to you that's, struggling with mental health or addiction or, homelessness, not necessarily, but the two, mental health and addiction. And we take, that for granted and kind of push it off to the side, and it's just as important as our physical health is, mental health is. And that's kind of like a big focus of like what we do is like focus a little bit on the mental health as well as the addictions.
Right. And I wonder, I was thinking this week, actually, there's like when in regards to dopamine, and not to try to sound like a clinician or anything like this, but like
Trying to learn on the show, Luke.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just, you look into substance use, like that's really all we're doing, right? It's just dopamine triggers, dopamine triggers, dopamine triggers. And there's so much of the community that we serve that lives so disconnected from like real community. You look at the studies, of just family dynamics and that type of thing, like kids that were ignored when they're younger and their dopamine receptors and that type of thing. And I wonder, I have no like evidence to back this up, but part of our program is really inviting people into like a safe community that really cares. And I wish we could really find some like quantitative data to show the impact of that. But I just know that there's so many people who won't leave here because they know like this is how I'm successful. And it's not just because I have supervision like UAs and stuff. And it's not just because I have a case manager who's going to show me like what I have, but it's because like my brother and sister beside me who knows what I'm going through, who's going through the same thing. And there's almost like that, it's that familial, the familial thing where it's almost like a dopamine rush in itself when you are like nurtured in an environment like this.
It is wild when people who didn't have good, healthy, relationships experience that. I can speak to that. You learn how to communicate, be authentic, tell the truth. And when you feel other people who are able to, as we teach on the show, get out of your own head and communicate with somebody, relate to one another, care about other people, men in general, we're nice, but we're too narcissistic in our own head to be kind, right?
Yeah.
So interestingly, Luke, this is not the kind of like dopamine receptor data that you're looking for, but in therapy research study, attachment security is the big thing that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma, you don't trust people, right? Insecure attachment, people are going to leave you, all that fight or flight stuff that gets really queued up. There's evidence that 5 years in a stable relationship, so you would think of that as a romantic, but often other types of relationships can show major improvement in attachment security. So what it says, if you went in a family that was, 10, 15, 20 years of your life with a lot of violence or neglect or abuse, like you talked about, it takes a long time of stability and healthy relationships to turn the tide. And I talk about in therapy, guys, I'm sure you think about this with your patients, like it's not a light switch, everything's a dimmer switch. And you're just trying to get 1% better every day, move the needle on the spectrum as you just did there, Joel. And so it's really nice. I'm sure, it's often a time, I'm sure, where most of these people are experiencing a safe environment to talk and feel, maybe for the first time in their lives.
Well, and it's interesting too, like you mentioned our podcast, Creature Theory. I mean, that comes from like a different place for me, like driving into Aurora from a nicer neighborhood and you see somebody, on the corner looking for money, or you see somebody slouched over, obviously on substances or the bus line and whatnot, right? And it's so easy to go, man, they're other. Like, what is that creature type of thing, right? And then the second that you realize their story and the dysfunction and maybe the disorder that they're in the middle of, it all starts to make sense. Like, of course. And even particularly with the homeless community, and which is so intermingled with substance use, like part of that disorder and dysfunction is attractive because in some ways there's freedom there, right? There's nobody telling you what to do. There's you answer to no one. So that sounds really nice. Yeah. But at the same time, it comes with the territory as well of like, you're not safe. You don't really know the connections you're making because it's so transient. And then as opposed to that, you step into like a transitional housing organization that really actually has the services. It starts to unwind all that dysfunction and that disorder that comes with all of that territory. Like I said, you start to I've lived with this person for 3 months, not just been in a tent on the street by him for a couple days type of thing.
Should give a shot of perspective on homelessness. Sean talked about Jesus Saves or Denver Rescue Mission. Great work here in town. If you're trying to stay in that shelter, every morning the place gets cleared out and then you get in line to stay that night. You do not know that day, unless you just camp out, you never leave that spot, whether you're going to have a bed there that night. So that just gives you an idea of what Luke was saying, how, yes, there are some people who had lives or maybe a schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, that drive them to want that independence of homelessness. That's counterbalanced with like, you never know where you're sleeping that night. And clearly that's why you guys feel so purposeful in your mission of helping people with that basic security. Like Sean, you experience it. I have never had a night where I did not know where I was going to sleep that night. And truly, brother, I won't even pretend to understand what that's like.
Well, that's the thing too. We get a lot of clients when they come in who will say, like on the phone to Sean or one of the other managers, hey, I used a little bit. Is that all right? Like they're just preparing for that. Like, oh shit, now what? Like, where do I go? What do I do? And every time we say, just get here and we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out.
Because that's the most important thing is, like we've said, we don't want these people having to just like sprawl the streets. And I used to work at the St. Francis Center down the street from Jesus Saves. And it was the same deal. That was a day shelter. And so we didn't get to keep people at night. They had to leave and had to go figure it out. So we'd spend a lot of times during the day getting those plans in place, getting shifters called, getting things figured out. And it's hard, especially in a place like Denver where it's freezing. I mean, the lawsuit that created the position I was there for at the time was based on a woman froze to death. So it was that global lawsuit, 15, 20 years ago.
It's been, and it got -10 here last week, Joel, as you talk about that. Sean, I don't think on the show have talked about the idea of peer counselors or peer coaches, and that's a big part of your role there. So how did you get involved in that? And what's that, that experience like?
Yeah. So when I first came to Ananeo, I was the one setting in on the groups originally. It was kind of a smaller crowd back then, and kind of like a little tight knit community. And I just got involved with the coaches that were there, and I was like, "Hey, man, what is this that y'all are doing? I need to be involved in this." I was like, I got something to say, and I feel like I can help people. So I got involved with the C-CAR peer coaching, took all the classes, got the certifications. Pretty simple process, and then it's all based off of like life experience. Everything we do is to like guide, to support, to provide resources, and just be there for these men and women in time of need. But yeah, I got involved straight through Ananeo, through Luke and Joey, kind of put me on a mission like, hey, we want more for you. What are you willing to do? Let's create these different avenues for people, create these different styles of coaching. So over time we brought on, so many different type of people from different, aspects, different worlds, to help coach, because we deal with so many different people that are coming from so many different lifestyles. But yeah, I mean, coaching was, I feel like it's something I've always really done. I kind of done it when I was in prisons as well. I kind of ran a little boxing program there for a little while, but it was more or less like, I still couldn't hurt a fly. I'm not good at it.
If you're only listening, guys, I'm sure Sean's got some experience scrapping, but Luke's a big boy. So I'm not sure these two have ever squared up, but I don't know.
Yeah. I got Sean to the mats. Sean came to the mats.
Yeah, he got me in jiu-jitsu. Yeah. That's only one time though. No. Yeah, but yeah, so we like our focus is just not one group of people, right? It's not one group of people. So that's why we brought on people from different cultures, from different races, and different, all views, right? Because we never know who's walking through the door next. We never know who we're going to deal with, right? And we try not to turn no one down based off of I always tell people like, hey man, this is not a one and done program. This is not like a, we expect you to change your life in one day, right? You've been having trauma. You've been having, heartache and despair for 25, 30 years. That's been happening since you were a teenager. So, we don't expect people to change their life in one day. That's just not realistic, That's the way that we use our coaching. A lot of guys will say like, man, I'm going to fellow you, Sean. I'm like, well, listen, I'd rather you be honest with me and tell me. That way I know I can work with the truth. I can't work with dishonesty or a lie. I can work with the truth. And as long as you tell me that I can guide you to where you need to be next. I can get you to the next step, as long as you'll work with me. And that's the way we coach. So,
teaching people accountability, is so 100%. Important. Is like, hey, look, talk with kids about this. It's like, you don't want your parent, you don't want your teacher like guessing what's going on in your head. You just tell the truth, because it's way better than having somebody guess what you're thinking, and like you said, Sean, accountability can start with that simple step of like, no, I used last night, or I used a couple days ago. I'm gonna fail this, and at least give us a good foot to start on.
Well, and I'll add this too, Steve. And then the huge part of our peer coaching is actually education. Mm-hmm. I talk to people all the time that want to get into recovery or want to, get sober. It's really not much different than getting fit and physical fitness. Oh, yeah. And you guys could maybe tell me some of the more like different differences there, but like when you want to lose some weight, you probably just think, oh, I'm just not going to eat that, and I might do a little bit of this. Just don't do that, right? And then you start to educate yourself, and then you start to get fit, because you realize it's actually more of, what am I eating, what am I doing, how am I sleeping? It's so much more dynamic of an issue than you think it is originally. It's the same with recovery. There's so many people who come into recovery, and man, that is like the boldest thing ever. It's like the hardest thing to do is to start. But if you don't have the education and the understanding that it's more about the healthy habits that you build and the things that you actually do, as opposed to just, oh, I'm just not going to use, you're probably not going to be very successful. And that's what's so powerful about our 25 peer coaches on staff. They're constantly educating. Hey, what about this? Are you going to the gym? Are you getting outside? Are you getting sunlight? It's a very holistic approach. And I think that's why there's a lot of success there for people who remain in our program a long time, is ultimately because they're being educated and and supported.
There's this interesting line in both rehab and the world in general, like peer coaches. There is a clear draw to help the average person talk to a peer coach who knows you've been in their shoes, they've been there,
for sure,
and you don't have all the fart sniffy bullshit of being a clinician. Sean, when are you talking with somebody and you think, I'm out of my element here, brother, let's make sure you talk to Joel or one of the clinicians?
That does happen. Yeah. I don't know. I try to relate to everybody, right? And just because I got such a crazy background, right? And where I come from and this and that, right? Up, down, across the other side. So, I mean, most of the guys that we deal with, we even have some guys that are, competency based, right? Like they're with like competency courts, and they come in and sometimes they're a little bit more acute. They're a little bit more, in need of help, like on a personal
severe
level.
mental health.
And not just about addiction, right? Once it kind of passes the threshold of like, my main problem is addiction, and it's more like my main problem is my mental health, that's when we send them to Joel or to Megan or to Selena or
for
to
the depression, the trauma, the bipolar, schizophrenia. Yeah, that makes sense too. And it's really nice to what we're really trying to do on this show is normalize addiction. I loved your guys' episode. If you want to get a similar and different framework on addiction, the creature theory guy, you all did that well. The idea of like, we all do shit to give us a feeling we wish we had or take a feeling away. It's not that complicated. And Sean, like your point of like, look, we can all work with that. If you're human and you listen and you understand, we can all work with that feeling. I get frustrated. I'm sure you guys do too. And people are like, I just don't understand this person's blank addiction. I'm like, the hell you don't. Right. And so then it gets hot to handle when they're using substances for, voices in their head or paranoia or suicidal thoughts. And Joel, I see you shaking your head. You must have got something to say.
Well, I was just going to add in that, and likewise too. I feel like there's certainly lines in the sand where then we come to Sean and say, hey, how do we put this together and what are we missing too? Because I don't see it as like, oh, it escalates to us. I think it's back and forth. I mean, like Sean and I pretty much every day. Because of that, we really want that holistic perspective. But yeah, ultimately, I feel like a lot of substance use is kind of like treated independently. And like we said earlier, it's like it's a symptom of something else, whether it's pain or trauma or whatever, maybe it's mental health. It's kind of rolled into those things. And so I think if we just tell people, like we were saying, just don't use, okay, Nancy Reagan, like, thank you, but that's not how it works. Like, there's so much more tied to that is like, because if that's what worked, we would have a lemonade stand and not a 230-page facility, So that's what we really approach it as too, is like, what else is going on? Like, how do we, maintain the sobriety, but we're not going to slap your hand for that. We're just going to work with you because it's peeling back those layers to like, what else is going on? How do we get underneath?
Too, I mean, Stephen, that's like the value to having somebody like Joel, somebody like Sean, and like Joey and I. Like Joey and I, our background is not recovery, addiction, any of that. That's a lot of the times you have different facilities where it's like, I'm just going to do what works for me. And it's not necessarily like dynamic and personalized. And so with like Joel's expertise, Sean's experience, and our different take on it, I mean, I think we're able to offer a real litany of services that really are like, how do we just get you well? How do we make this work? As opposed to, no, this is the road, you're on it, let's just do it.
I know Joey is an attorney, right? Oil and gas. And then what's your background, Luke? How'd you get involved?
I
tell him, Luke.
Tom, I don't know what I asked.
Well, I left, I went out of high school and played hockey and football 1 year, but I was a professional snowboarder like all through high school. And then through that, my dad was just kind of like, hey, you need to go, you got these scholarships, go do this. And when I need to see you do this, and then if you don't like it, you can go. So I snowboarding, and that's where like honestly party scene, all that type of stuff, got deep into everything. And then I became a pastor. So pastor for 8 years. And what I noticed is just that, and this is not a dig, like I'm still personally a believer, that type of thing, but like the church just wasn't doing what it should be doing in the community. I'd go into prison facilities and just talk to people and hear their struggles and where they came from and their stories. And it's just like, why is nobody helping with this housing issue and getting people away from, their wrongdoings and the Department of Correction? I think for me, Stephen, I love redemption. I love people getting second chances. I love seeing people get back up. And I'm not totally responsible for that, but that's really the heart behind starting Ananeo. Is just like, why are all these people who have all these different upbringings and have less than I had. Like, why are they not given these opportunities to get back on their feet? So that's how I got into it.
True. I mean, that's the idea here, is if we know that prevention is not widespread in this country, like, how do we hold people? Why do we hold people accountable for things that they just never could have known, never would have known different? How on earth could they? Thinking about that, like, kind of the community you all balance, Sean, any of you all could speak to this, like, you're getting people from the prison system, which is a notoriously factioned, right? We think about gang violence in prisons, things like that. I'd imagine y'all are dealing with a pretty diverse community. How do you keep the peace?
Absolutely. I mean, connecting. I think it's all through connection, right? I think that's the basis of peer coaching, is like connecting with people that are on the same, level as you, playing on the same field. A lot of those guys coming out of prison, like, most of our staff has, been incarcerated, involved as far as our peer coaches and stuff. So, I mean, we instantly connect, like, oh man, where'd you come from? Oh, okay. Well, you kind of, knowing where they came from, you can kind of relate to their situation, and then it just starts from there. Like, we as coaches all interact every day. A lot of the way that we've built a program is like this wellness hub, and then, everything's on site and staff is there at all times, 24 hours a day. Staff, like, most of our staff lives on site with the clients, which makes for like this environment where it's like, hey man, we're kind of family. We kind of live right next door to each other.
Right. Yeah.
So it's one of those things, like if someone is coming out of prison and it's gang related, well, that's crazy, because we have one of the biggest gang members in Colorado at one time that actually works for us. His name's Woody, and he's a great coach, and he can relate to anybody. Incredible. And he, he's obviously changed his life over the years, and he can relate to people in that aspect, and then, we got a lot of guys that come up, from the South and the culture that I grew up in. So I can relate to these guys, and then, Brandon comes from just an odd background that can relate to people. We're on the same field with them. We're doing the same thing as them. So it's pretty simple, actually.
Luke, did it take time to build a culture like that? Because what I'm hearing, Sean, is like, well, we have a culture of tolerance. We have a culture of acceptance and community. And that's great. So somebody walks into that, and if they're out of line, they either learn quick or they're going to be out the door, I assume, if they're violent. But like, Luke, did it take time to build a system like that?
Well, I don't know. Half the time I'm constantly like wondering what my position here and what I bring to the table. Like, I've just always been that. I've just always loved people, man, and I love getting to understand where people are coming from and what lights them up, and what, and like, when you talk about like gang status, STG, like, we have literally every gang under our roof. 211, Aryan, Blood, Crip, Sereno, everybody lives here. And I think it's because like our staff genuinely cares about people and genuinely has an interest. And we're not telling anybody to leave the ride, so to say. Like, I'm not doing that, because in a lot of ways, if you really look into gangs, that's their freaking family. That's right. The people who really loved them and cared for them in a way that maybe they didn't have in a normal family dynamic. So I think for us, it's like our attitude towards recovery and reentry. Like, I'm not trying to change you. I'm not sure as hell not trying to judge you. Like, the only thing that will get you, kind of out of our community is violence. We just don't have time for that. And we do have it happen. But we handle it and we move on. And so, to your question, Stephen, about like creating culture, I think that's just kind of how we've always been. Sean, I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit to that, because you've been here the second longest. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of the guys I know, like on a personal level, it's not just from jail, but they confide in us, right? They're like, we're all they got. A lot of the people that come here, let's like speak on holidays, right? But one of our locations, we house about 115 men total. And on Christmas,
and 50 women,
and 50 women at the same site. So, Thanksgiving and Christmas this year, we had 100 guys, at those events like that. We served food and just kind of hung out with everybody and talked. And, there was 100 people there, and in a normal setting, most people would have been with their families, right? So in a lot of these situations, we are these guys' family. Like, we're all they got. We're all they know right now. And like, we're probably one of the only positive influences in their life. they're clinging to that, like they're attracted to that. They're like, this is, if they're there, then they're obviously making that first step to say like, hey, I need some kind of change in my life. And one of the common things I hear guys say all the time is, man, I'm just glad to be surrounded by you guys that are doing good. And I'm like, and I always counter it with like, hey man, I never forget where I came from. And that's how I know to relate to you. I come from where you come from. And that makes us on the same plane. And we never try to pass judgment, right? Like people are like, man, I know people are going to look at me like as a bad person. I'm like, man, I'll never look at you like that. I just understand that you made bad decisions, right?
Yep.
That doesn't make you a bad person. You made bad decisions.
The key is people learning that difference, Sean, right? That this was a past and you have a chance. There's never a wrong time to change or tell the truth or shape that up. And you guys have brought up the numbers a few times. I mean, obviously 220 beds is such a valuable part of the community. I would assume y'all have a wait list. What's the process of moving on? I mean, being discharged, quote unquote.
Man, it's really hard to get discharged from Ananeo. Let's put it that way. It's really hard.
Want to move on? I mean, do people try?
They do. Well, yeah, they do.
Don't want to. I mean, right? But like, is that the goal?
Yeah, we just dealt with a situation today. A guy came in and he was like, "Hey, man, I just really want to, tell you I appreciate it." He's like, "I finally got my own place. Man, I've been working and doing what y'all said, and it actually worked." And we're like, "Hey, man, it's just a process, But we got guys that have been there for what." 2 years, right? 2 or 3 years. Yeah, 2 or 3 years because, like everybody's path is different. Everybody's approach is different. So everybody's time frame is different too. But I mean, yeah, the ultimate goal is for us to get you to where you're taking care of yourself, right? Like, let's get you, me and Luke talk about this all the time. If last week a guy OD'd on fentanyl and he comes to our facility and he's been there for a week and he gets a job at Taco Bell, that is a straight up success, right?
Oh yeah.
100%.
I mean, last week he could have been another obituary, and but this week he's got a job and he's being productive and he's actually clean and sober. That is a success to us, and like we don't put these large expectations on someone who's been incarcerated for 20 years or homeless for 20 years or battling addiction for 20 years. We put them in a position to keep realistic goals, to set realistic goals for the future and put them in a realistic spot. We obviously know when people leave Ananeo, they're not moving into Beverly Hills. That's
right.
That's not realistic. That's not realistic. So we try to set them up for like a realistic situation. Like, hey man, when you leave here, this is what you're going to face, but just know we're here to back you and support you even when you leave. And when people know that, then they start making those steps for like, oh man, maybe I can take care of myself. Maybe I can do something with myself.
It's a good point, Sean, because if you get incarcerated when you're young, 16, 18, you like don't have any experience taking care of yourself. Most people who end up incarcerated are going from a parent's home into the system and out at 5, 10, 20 years later. And it's like, why on earth would you know anything besides what your mama was telling you to do and then what the system, what the guards were telling you to do? And so it's a good point, Sean. Like a lot of people are literally learning the life skills to take care of themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's this dichotomy as well. I think you mentioned, do a lot of people want to stay here, Stephen? Yes, they do.
Yeah,
a lot of people, and it's that extensive incarceration that you talk about, the 5, 10, 20 years. Ultimately, they don't feel comfortable in community. No. Like I'll never forget, like I love taking guys out to lunch. That's what I do all the time. And you sit there and guys look at a menu and they're lost because there's so many options. Like and then they do this and all they say is, I'll get what he gets, because they're like embarrassed because they're taking so long to order. Where DOC, you get a tray, you're going to eat what's on that tray, right? It just is what it is. And so, the point that I'm making is like, there's such a tight-knit community here through lived experience that when they do go elsewhere, it just feels so other. So it's both ways. Like I think the average citizen looks at them as other, and I think that they maybe never believe they can be that average everyday citizen. It's a little bit of a different, there's a crucible there and a crux, and you're definitely trying to break that down with them.
I know we think about this with the military a lot and veterans coming back after being told like what to do for so long. I will just say I'm getting a little goosebumpy. Like I did not wake up this morning thinking that I was gonna wrap my head around the idea of not making choices, not having like Your schedule is what it is. You're eating what you're eating. Your yard time is what your yard time is. And I listen, I'm sure you guys have heard of like the Ear Hustle podcast and things like that. It's huge. Like, I try to understand what life on the inside is like. I worked at it, but like the fuck, you go a year, you go a month without making a decision, right? And it's like, you're going to be paralyzed by it, Luke. So I think you painted such a beautiful picture there of like, you look at a menu, shit, even if it's just Applebee's, right? Like, you're going to be like, wait, I could choose 20 different things. Like,
Never taking the time to even do that.
Move on. You know?
Yeah, I think just even what you're saying there, Stephen, and I'll never knock other organizations trying to do well for people. It's just different attitudes, I think. But something that really grinds my gears is when, I see, and sometimes it's from peers, but there's just this like, snap, buddy, you got to get after it. We're doing this thing. You got to figure it out. And it's just there's no empathy involved in like the understanding of how critical like the first 30 days of reentry are.
Oh yeah.
And it's just kind of like, why are we handling it this way?
Yeah.
Like, we're trying to get them on a hamster wheel. So for what? Like, it's the outcomes that everybody thinks that are needed, right? Employment. You need to show your sobriety. You need to not get in any trouble. Yada, yada, yada. Yes, those are important things, but like, it's not the full picture of what this whole issue actually is. Like, the issue here is that you're coming from such an extreme environment where there is no empathy, there is no love. Like, prison is insane. If you haven't visited, it is so nuts.
Oh.
And then, like, if they re-enter and we don't treat them differently and we don't show them empathy and love, it's just, like, we're having some outcomes, but it's not ultimately what we're trying to do. Like, I want the people who come through our program, like, I want 5 years from now to go get a beer with them at a restaurant and hear about what they're doing because they've got their recovery under control, and I'm not going to trigger them because I have a beer here. Like, that's what I want. I want like a full being. Like, I mean, you look into it, it's like a beatitude, like a genuine wellness deep within them. That's what I want to create in our clients, not just somebody who's out there got a job.
It's so awesome, guys. I mean, we could talk forever. I'm going to wrap us up because, I think, I hope you guys have enjoyed what you've heard today. We've got 3 people who are truly dedicated to a cause that, again, I would assume that most of the people, listening or watching our show just don't interact with this world every day. And I don't as much as I used to. And Sean has volunteered that when we're ready to try and give an insight into what incarceration is like to come back and talk with us in the future. So, gents, I don't know how much of the podcast you've been able to consume or see anything on the socials, but I'm rocking one of our hats. And we talk about our goal on the show is to create kinder, gentler bros. And Luke, I think you made such a good point about what you guys are doing is trying to really create a kinder, gentler reentry process and
100%.
What a big difference that makes. And Sean, how fortunate you were to land in these hands. I'm sure it's made a huge difference in this. And Luke, finding purpose in it, and Joel, meaningful work in our mental health business is always so important. So thank you guys so much. This is super cool. And, we'll wrap up this interview, guys, when we're back after the break to induct another Bromotions Hall of Fame member. When thinking about who to induct into the BHoF this week, when thinking about accountability, I was thinking about what our friend Luke in the Ananeo crew said earlier in this episode, where he loves a redemption story. That really sparked me wanting to talk about one of my favorite redemption stories, one of my favorite podcasts, and that is Ear Hustle co-host Earlonne Woods, inducting this week into the Bromotions Hall of Fame. Born August 13th, 1971 in South Los Angeles, the child of a postal worker mother, his father unemployed and struggled with alcoholism. Earlonne described him as violent and distant growing up. As you might imagine, growing up in a difficult part of South Los Angeles, we've all heard of South Central, those kinds of areas. Earlonne was exposed to substances, violence, and gang affiliation at an early age, began dealing drugs at age 14, and along with his older brother, robbing drug dealers at age 15. Interacting with law enforcement very young, he'd already had 2 strikes as a minor when he had another aggravated assault robbery charge In his 20s, he ended up being made an example of using the 3-strike rule. So if we're not going to dive all the way into the 3-strike rule here during the BHoF, I want Earlonne to get his cred, but I would take a look at the 3-strike rule. That's something you've never heard of, but in the 90s, there was a wave of, if you've committed 3 felonies, we're putting you away for life. That's a kind of a 3 strikes and you're out rule, or what's been called the McDonaldization of criminal justice, making it just kind of like a fast food chain. Earlonne served most of his time in California, and when he heard about the media program at San Quentin State Prison in San Francisco, he asked for a transfer up there where he ended his sentence. In 2017, he became the co-host of the Ear Hustle podcast, along with Nigel Poor, who was a volunteer at the prison. In 2021, after his release, he'd co-authored This Is Ear Hustle book, and they were him, Nigel Poor, and another one of their co-hosts, Rashawn New York Thomas, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting in the past. So a really, really, really cool story. Obviously somebody like Earlonne, interacting with the criminal justice system at such a young age, really has had the opportunity to show a lot of growth and to show what kind of a good person he is. So I want to take an opportunity to read a few quotes about Earlonne from media. So Sarah Larson from the New Yorker described him as an immediately warm and likable presence, which I agree with on the air. Eddie Harana from Rolling Stone praised his sense of humor and, again, warmth that he brings to the show. How Earlonne got out from what was once a 31 plus or to life sentence after some success of the podcast in 2008, California Governor Jerry Brown commuted Woods' sentence, saying he had clearly shown that he is no longer the man that he was when he committed the crime, and that he set a positive example for his peers, and through his podcast has shared meaningful stories from those inside prison. Woods went on to thank Brown and join him on the podcast shortly thereafter. As Luke talked about, redemption, knowing that people can grow, knowing that people can change is super important, and an important part of why we need to be considering the prison system and considering how can our criminal justice system be about reform and be about improving people rather than a holding place for continued lack of growth and lack of emotional development. So Earlonne is one of those guys who clearly show that when you're young and you're in a violent area, it is hard to grow and mature, and some time, space, age, maturity, and perspective have made him really, truly a role model, not only for me, but for people in his community. So if you're interested, in lieu of playing any media today, I welcome you to go to earhustlesq.com. And we talked about this during the interview, the idea of, wow, I didn't think I was going to wake up today thinking about the idea of what must it be like in prison to never make a choice. In October of 2021, Ear Hustle challenged their listeners to do the Ear Hustle Challenge, back when those things were very popular, which was living 30 days on a schedule as if you're in prison. Wake up at the same time, shower only 5 minutes, eat the same few meals, eat off of a tray. And it's super cool. They give you all the accoutrements you want. You start the episode and they're talking about the spork you have, the cup you have, the tray you use to eat off of, and just kind of wrapping your head again around what serving 5, 10, 15, 20 years in prison must be like when you're truly taking choice away and having to deal with those kinds of things as you look to grow and improve from whatever it was that landed you there in the first place. So again, we're not often thinking about empathy for criminals, especially those who are felons or have been violent. And let's remember that accountability is a big part of growing up. And a lot of people do, even after making big mistakes, go on to take accountability, grow, and learn. We'll be back up to wrap up the show after this. Let's end as we do, citing our sources and kicking it to some takeaways. For the intro, Richie and I used Om Young-Mi-suk's article about Draymond and his redemption tour from ESPN.com. The Ananeo boys, of course, want to shout out their website, ananeo.org, and the Creature Theory podcast. That'll be in their episode description. And when we talk about Earlonne Woods, earhustlesq.com is where you can find everything about him in the website. Used a little help from Wikipedia as well. So just no 3 takeaways. 1 takeaway today. Accountability, when used right, is pervasive in the themes of the show that we've learned on, right? We don't always create our problems, and yet it is on us to solve them, is a huge DBT tenet. And just the fact that if you can say, my bad, my bad. They make this joke on shrinking. They do this all the time. A very simple, take a breath, recognize when you had a role in something. It can disarm anger, increase your relational capacity with others, bring people closer to you, and really just start from a place of honesty. So all I'm going to say this week is thinking about that accountability should be a big theme of your week as you look to create a kinder and gentler world. Very exciting stuff coming up next week as we look to gap between the addiction block and neurodivergence block of episodes. We're going to be having internet's first therapist fantasy draft. So you've heard of fantasy football, fantasy baseball, heck, even The Bachelor has fantasy stuff now. This is going to be drafting therapists whom we believe would make good co-workers of ours as we start to practice. Trust me, we just got done recording. It was the nerdiest thing I've ever done and tons of fun. I hope y'all will benefit from it, even if you're not clinicians. Otherwise, we'll see y'all next time.